Has the Republican Party transformed into a cult? Well, that's been on my mind a lot the past few years, and especially lately when Representative Andy Ogles introduced a proposal to allow Donald Trump to serve a third term. It would essentially allow presidents who serve non-consecutive terms to get a third term in there. So guys like Bush and Obama would be unable to serve a third term because their terms were consecutive. So yeah, he's kissing the ring and trying to get Trump in there for 12 years total. And who knows, maybe if Trump got a third term, he'd introduce legislation to allow him to serve a fourth term. But yeah, I'm going to be talking about the arguments for and against the idea that the Republican Party has turned into a cult. So let's start off with some of the ideas against the Republican Party being a cult. And I think there are actually a fair number of these. I'm critical of the Republican Party a lot, but I can admit that there are some things that don't resemble cults within their own party. And I'm talking mostly about a cult in favor of Donald Trump. So recently we had a vote on Pete Hegseth, we as in the Senate, for Secretary of Defense. Pete Hegseth, a guy with a lot of problems, alcoholism, infidelity, sexual abuse, getting called out by his own mom. He is a guy who has a lot of problems, a neocon and a Trump loyalist, as I often say. So there were actually 3 Republicans who voted against him. Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and one Mitch McConnell, Cocaine Mitch, as people sometimes call him, the former Senate Majority Leader, came out and said, no, Donald Trump, you're not getting this one past us. This guy is not qualified. And it was a surprise to me when I covered it. It really was. Because Collins and Murkowski are more moderate, but Mitch McConnell is not moderate. He is a guy who pretty solidly backs a hard right agenda. Now, he's not a guy who's like a total populist bomb thrower like Trump. He doesn't quote Adolf Hitler. He doesn't say neo-Nazi stuff. But he's a pretty hardcore Republican backer. Whatever the Republicans say goes with him. And whatever he says tends to go too. It's a very symbiotic relationship they have. But the Republicans are putting up a little bit of resistance to Trump's nominees. RFK Jr., the fact that he's a former Democrat, people are already talking about the fact that that might irk some Republicans in Congress. They might say, well, this guy's a former Democrat, so I'm not going to vote for him because Democrat bad. And in which case, it's like, hey, they'd be sticking their finger up to Trump in a sense that they're saying, no, Mr. President, appoint an actual Republican. So in that case, what it seems like the Republican Party is pursuing more is self-preservation, preserving their party, and making sure that there's actual people in office and in Trump's administration who have historically had an R next to their name, not a D next to their name, not people who are part of iconic Democratic Party families like RFK Jr. is. So that's one sign that Republican politicians are becoming less cult-like. There's also the fact, I thought of this, but you know, who was the previous Republican president before Trump? It was George W. Bush. And George W. Bush was a guy who became increasingly difficult for Republicans to defend, especially after the Great Recession, where it's like, oh gosh, the good economy slipped away from our fingertips. Now we don't really have much going for us at all. The Iraq War now is pretty much universally loathed by Americans. The Afghanistan War, fairly similar, probably not quite as hated, but the Iraq War, particularly infamous. Bush and Cheney are not popular at all, especially Cheney. Bush left office with a 24-25% approval rating. Cheney left office with one even lower than that, in the teens. So Republicans had a hard time defending this guy. They had a hard time defending the optics of the Iraq War or the Great Recession. So Obama takes office and they spend time on the defensive complaining about Obama, saying he wasn't born in America, criticizing the Affordable Care Act for allowing the government to take too much control over our healthcare system, criticizing his foreign policy, sometimes attacking him for drone strikes, sometimes attacking his Environmental Protection Agency too, sometimes attacking him for supposedly wanting to take guns. But they need a champ to rise up. And the 2016 Republican primary brings a bunch of different people to the table, like Ted Cruz, John Kasich, Marco Rubio, and then, of course, Donald Trump. So, yeah, they gravitate toward him. A big chunk of them do. Ted Cruz places second, but he still gets beaten down pretty badly by Trump. It's not a super close primary. And part of me wants to think that the reason that they clung so aggressively to Trump was because they felt disaffected with Bush. Kind of the same with Mitt Romney and John McCain, that they didn't feel like someone was there who was actually fighting for them and fighting against the Democrats and fighting against so-called leftism, so-called Marxism, so-called social justice warriors. And they saw Donald Trump and they were like, okay, it feels cool to support this guy. This guy is unapologetic. This guy's aggressive. This guy swears. This guy doesn't care what other people think, generally speaking. And he's an outsider. He's never been in office before. He's a former celebrity. He's in his 70s. He's well known. He's a household name. So they see that and they're like, this is the antidote to the George W. Bush presidency and how badly it embarrassed us by early 2009. So they're like, yeah, okay, Trump is the solution. Because it had been a long time since Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was the last truly popular Republican president. H.W. Bush was very popular at one point in his presidency, but by the end of it, the economic downturn that had happened allowed Bill Clinton to easily cruise to victory, and he just was not popular. His foreign policy successes were strongly overlooked in favor of the lousy economy. So George H.W. Bush left office on a mediocre to poor note. George W. Bush left office on a bad note. So they're kind of coasting off of Reagan by the time Trump starts running. Like, Reagan was great. We need a Republican to be like Reagan because the Bushes were just a little too meek and flaccid or whatever. That's an odd choice of word. But, you know, they're guys with not that much spine. They seem a little too left-leaning. I mean, George W. Bush, Medicare Part D. George H.W. Bush was kind of an environmentalist in some ways, actually. So they're like, oh, we need someone to come along and just really ignite some passion and conservatism and just say climate change is a hoax. Just talk tough on the border, stop letting illegal immigrants in. And Donald Trump had all that to a T. So I guess my point is that it could have been someone else. It could have been. You know what? I'll say this, that if someone like Ron DeSantis had run in 2016, a guy who actually seemed like he was fairly similar to Trump back in 2018, but started to kind of deviate in terms of his rhetoric. Like, he said wokeness more often. Trump has kind of not been a big fan of that term. He said people can't even define wokeness, so he tends to not use it as much. But back in 2018, Trump and Ron DeSantis were like best friends. Trump was campaigning for Ron DeSantis to be governor. And I just think that the guy, you know, he campaigned on building the wall too, Ron DeSantis. I think that if a guy like that had been the 2016 Republican nominee, they would have gotten a very popular following within the Republican Party. So I don't know. Do they really like Trump all that much? Or are they just like, yeah, we kind of do just like the rebellious feeling of it. Like, if another candidate came along and had that same thing, or did what Trump does better than Trump, they would actually abandon Trump and jump ship to the new person who does Trump stuff better than Trump. It's interesting to think about. It's also interesting to think about some of the backlash that Trump got, and it's not that much from his own base, though, for bragging about the vaccine, Operation Warp Speed, if you will. He's like, yeah, no, Operation Warp Speed. He's talking about it at a rally, and he got booed by his own base. That's pretty damning. So he stopped running on the idea that the vaccine is cool. He stopped talking about it because he knows he doesn't want to kick his base too hard. He's not perfectly in lockstep with them, but when he gets booed by them, then he knows he's in deep trouble. So vaccine is a no-go for him now. He even attacked RFK Jr. on the campaign trail for being pro-vaccine. So talk about a pivot. He also banned bump stocks in February 2018 after the Parkland school shooting, something that was criticized aggressively by conservatives. I remember seeing people like Matt Christensen, who's right-leaning, but he's not a Trump cultist. He thinks for himself. I would give him that. Criticizing Trump for that, saying that it violates the Second Amendment. And you know what? They're being pretty consistent with their views. Kyle Rittenhouse originally said, I'm not a fan of Trump during this election. He's like, we need to vote for the Constitution, and Trump was not great on the Second Amendment. Then, unfortunately, he got bullied into supporting Trump. MAGA X users dunked on him until he was forced to acquiesce, forced to say, well, I guess Trump is the better option, you know? So there's a little bit of rebelliousness against Trump, but then there's also a little bit of like, you will submit to Trump. And then sometimes they do submit to Trump. So that's my spiel on why I don't think that the Republican Party is a cult, why they may not be a cult, at least, reasons against it. Let's talk about some of the reasons for. There was a recent poll that showed that Republicans, that Trump supporters actually support, they would be more likely to trust Donald Trump over religious leaders and their own family members. You know what? This, just plain and simple, cuts against one of the core tenets of conservatism. Conservatism is big in terms of its appeal to religion. You would think that they would want to defer to religious leaders over Donald Trump. Many of them are evangelicals. If not evangelicals, they are religious, Christian, Protestant. So you would think that they would feel more sympathetic to the religious leaders or to their own family members. What happened to family values? Doesn't family values mean trusting each other over some random politician in Washington, D.C.? Because that's what Trump is. I mean, he is one man. It would be one thing, I think, if they said, oh, they trust the entire Republican Party more than they trust their family member, because then it's like, okay, well, which members of the Republican Party? Because there are some Republicans who are way more honest than Trump. And let's face it, sometimes you do have family members who are just complete liars, and they are hard to trust. So I suppose you have to go about it on a case-by-case basis and look at the family members of the people who were polled. But still, it's very concerning that people who support Trump are like, yeah, I would trust him over my own family members, my religious leaders. It's concerning. There has been some backlash to Trump over H-1B visas. Originally, it was directed at Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, but then when Trump came in and sided with them, Republicans and the hard right base rebelled against Trump briefly. It seems to have died down, though. It seemed like against Trump, it was a lot more brief. Against Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, though, it was much more aggressive. There was a right-wing YouTube channel that I saw speaking about Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, actually, that was calling them leftists over that take. Leftists. Vivek Ramaswamy, the guy who wants people to take a civics test in order to vote if they're under the age of 25, is a leftist and a Democrat, they were saying. So this is, again, a sign of someone who's within the Trump cult. They say, oh, Vivek Ramaswamy is a Democrat for saying this, and yet this same right-wing YouTuber did not call Donald Trump a Democrat for supporting H-1B visas. Trump, of course, used to be a Democrat, which is the interesting thing. But yeah, the backlash against Trump was a lot more limited than the backlash against Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Now, I don't know how much weight you want to put on the fact that there was backlash against Trump at all. That could be evidence that we're not dealing with a cult here, but I don't know. You be the judge of that. I just think that the fact that it was so much more harsh against Musk and Ramaswamy indicates that, oh, they're pulling their punches when it comes to Trump. They'll defer to him, or they'll be a little mad, but then they'll quickly forgive him. The fact that they get mad in the first place, again, might be worth something, but at the end of the day, these people will always come back to forgiving Trump, and that's what's kind of scary. A lot of these people seem to have forgiven Trump for his bump stock ban. And that's kind of interesting, too, because it's like, okay, you claim to value the Constitution so much, and I know the Constitution may seem to a lot of progressives like it's ambiguous on the Second Amendment, but a lot of conservatives believe that the Second Amendment is unambiguous. So, by their own logic, Trump unambiguously violated the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. In his inauguration, he pledged to uphold the Constitution. So they're basically saying he violated his oath of office. And yet they're still supporting him, still licking his boots, still willing to vote for him against Kamala Harris and clap like seals over his inauguration, his bizarre inauguration speech, as Joe Rogan pointed out. So, yeah, the speed with which they forgive him and that they say, well, it's water under the bridge now, it's concerning, and it speaks to the idea of the Republican Party being a cult. We also need to talk about some of the shifts in the pro-life messaging. So Trump used to be a guy who was aggressively like, punish the woman for getting an abortion. Punish them. There needs to be some punishment. Then he shifted in a much more pro-choice direction. And I'm not saying he became pro-choice, but that he moderated. He moved closer to the pro-choice position. He used rhetoric such as saying that his administration would be great for reproductive rights. That is pro-choice coded rhetoric. It just is. Pro-lifers do not say things like that. So he went out there and he said all this stuff. He said, oh, it should be up to the states, no national abortion ban. And a lot of these evangelical types, they still were siding with the guy. The people who would cheer on a national abortion ban, they were like, yeah, no, Trump is great. I still stand with Trump. There were, of course, a minority of conservatives saying, well, he's bad on abortion and actually calling him out on that. But they still fell in line. They still fell in line and voted for him. So it was either people saying, yeah, no, he's fine on abortion, or, well, he's wrong on abortion, but I'm still going to fall in line. I'm still going to bend the knee, and I'm still going to vote for him. That is cultish. Even if they're being cultish to various degrees, that is still concerning. The other issue, let's just think about this. So there's MAGA hats all around. It's become like an icon. A lot of right-wingers will try to dunk on leftists and Democrats by saying, when was the last time that you saw someone in a Build Back Better hat? Think about that, huh? Nobody likes Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. They suck. And it's like, well, that's kind of a self-own, because you're basically admitting that Biden supporters and Harris supporters are not in cults like Donald Trump supporters are. So obviously they wouldn't see it that way. They would see it in the sense of, oh, well, they just don't have grassroots support. Regular people don't support him. It's all AstroTurf. But look, sometimes it's possible to have really strong opinions in your head, really strong views about a certain candidate, really liking Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or Barack Obama or whatever, but not going around wearing merch for them or swag or whatever you call it. No need to wear a Kamala Harris hat or a Joe Biden hat. No, we can just go out and live our lives and not be part of a cult for a political candidate. But some of these people on the hard right, they need to throw their MAGA hat on wherever they go. And you'll see people posting stuff like that on X, like, today I was so brave by going out and wearing a MAGA hat. And it's like, well, it's really not brave. I see people with Trump merch out and about, even in blue states. I was recently in a blue state, and they were wearing a Trump shirt, and there were many people around. Nobody was heckling them at all. So it's not brave to wear Trump clothing. It's not. Because progressives aren't going to attack you for it. A lot of the whole, they're being mean to MAGA, it was just much ado about nothing. But yeah, as I was saying, progressives, we don't need to go out and just beat down people who don't agree with us. We tend to just live our lives. And Trump supporters, it's like, well, can they do that much? They always have to throw on the merch. They have to talk about how Trump's a victim. I'm so excited to be voting for Donald Trump. And that's why it was kind of ridiculous hearing back in the day this whole silent majority thing. Richard Nixon coined the term, but Trump also used it. Silent majority stands with Trump. And it's like, okay, they're not all that silent. Now, some of them were, because Trump ended up doing better than the polls were suggesting he would be doing in this election. But a lot of these people, they're just loud and proud Trump fans. And you don't see it in the same way that you see progressives doing that. And if you look at most polls, they'll say that more Americans are actually Democrats and consider themselves liberal-leaning than people who are Republican or conservative-leaning. And yet it's so much more common to see pro-Republican, pro-Trump merch than it is to see pro-Democratic merch. So that's my spiel on the whole clothing situation. Policy, again, we have to talk about this whole war thing. One of the big talking points for Trump was, oh, he's anti-war. Come on, guys, just vote for him to own the deep state because he's against war. And it's like, now he's going out there and saying, it's time to get Greenland, it's time to get Panama, maybe Canada. He said that he wouldn't rule out using military force to acquire Greenland. Denmark owns Greenland. So he might break out the guns to tell Denmark, we get Greenland. That is some neocon nonsense if I ever saw it. And yet, a lot of the MAGA types are just saying, well, no, he's sicking it to the establishment. He's not a neocon. He's still not a neocon, guys. Please believe me. No. He has neoconservatism running through his veins. And just because he has this tough rhetoric on the establishment, just because he criticizes the Iraq War and George W. Bush and Hillary Clinton and Obama, doesn't mean that the guy can't employ neoconservative and or neoliberal foreign policy moves. He did plenty of that. I mean, remember his Venezuela policy, a coup in Venezuela under him. This whole thing with Juan Guaido. Juan Guaido is the real leader of Venezuela. Like, you can't just do that, dude. You can't just do that. So yeah, he's a loose cannon on foreign policy. In some ways, he makes more peaceful moves than the traditional neocons. Don't get me wrong. But in other ways, he's actually more aggressive, more fiery. War with Mexico over the cartels, sending ground troops to Mexico over the cartels. You know what? You may think that it's a perfectly fine justification, but the fact of the matter is he's still launching a ground war against someone who is in the North American continent, a country in the North American continent. You don't think that that's going to have disastrous consequences? And I mean, categorically, as I said, it's just plain neoconservative foreign policy. So, right-wingers, let's stop pretending that Trump is not a neocon. He kind of is. And the fact that a lot of them still pretend he's just fighting the establishment just shows that they're kind of in a cult. A good chunk of them are. There's also the whole tell it like it is thing. People say, I'm voting for Trump because he tells it like it is. How many times have you heard someone say that? Go to his PolitiFact profile. Look at the fact checks. Look at the explanations for why they graded him false or pants on fire on some of those. Look, I'm willing to grant that maybe PolitiFact could have been uncharitable on some of those, but for crying out loud, it's just plain anti-intellectualism to say, well, no, actually, all of the things that he said that are false or pants on fire are mostly false. They're actually just true. PolitiFact is just controlled by the deep state and the establishment, and they're just trying to make Trump look like a big bad liar. No, it's not as simple as that. And yeah, that's just plain anti-intellectualism, as I said. And that's what's concerning too, is like, do they actually believe this, or are they just turning their brains off on purpose, deliberately being obtuse in order to do propaganda for Trump, in order to run defense for him? It's reactionarianism 101. I think that's what you could say it really is. It's like, well, shoot, the media, the establishment doesn't seem to like this guy, so therefore, I'm just going to assume that everything that they say about him is false. That's cultish stuff. We also have to talk about the people pretending that Trump won a landslide. That was not a landslide. That was a relatively narrow popular vote victory. And in fact, one of the most narrow in American history, believe it or not. Within the past century, only 2 presidents who won the popular vote in their elections did so by a slimmer margin than Trump. How about that? I've talked about this in my previous videos. But yeah, there was not a landslide, and yet these people insist there was a landslide. Biden won by 7 million votes. And these people don't even believe Biden won the election just because they like Trump better. That's basically what it comes down to. Trump lost in every single court case. The courts laughed him out. Republican Trump-appointed judges said, no, you lost, dude. There was no rigging here. This was not a stolen election. This was the freest and the fairest election in American history. You lost by 7 million votes in that election. So yeah, not a good look. Definitely makes it appear like there's some cultish behavior going on here when you can't even admit that your candidate lost the presidential election by 7 million votes. You know what? You could even just say, well, I think that 1 million of those votes were fraudulent. And it's like, okay, he still lost by 6 million votes. So yeah, working backwards from your conclusions is something that cults often do. It's typical cult behavior. And I fear that the conclusion of a lot of the Trump supporters is that Trump is the good guy. Whenever he does anything, he just wins. So this election, even though it looks like he lost, he actually won it. Sleepy Joe Biden can't complete a sentence. He can't fill a room. He's campaigning from his basement. So that must mean that Trump won, because I see more people who like Trump. More people wear Trump hats than people who wear Biden hats. So Trump won the election. And then it leads to something like January 6th, where you have people storming the Capitol on behalf of one man who told people they were going to march on Washington. They call for hanging the vice president of that man because they view him as a traitor. They're chanting to hang Mike Pence because they're so angry that they feel he betrayed Trump. This is a guy who is a Republican. He's on the hard right too. He believed in things like conversion therapy, a strong proponent of tax cuts for the wealthy, just an overall extremely socially conservative guy, even by Republican Party standards, like far more socially conservative, particularly on LGBTQ issues, than Trump could ever dream of being. So that was just peak cultish behavior. But yeah, that about does it on my summary of whether or not the Republican Party is a cult. I've given you the reasons for the Republican Party being a cult, and I've given you the reasons against them being a cult. I will come to the conclusion, and I'm going to be charitable here, that the Republican Party at this moment is dominated by a vocal minority of pro-Trump people who just want Trump to win no matter what. But that some of those people could still abandon Trump. There is still a chance. This might seem like copium, like, oh yeah, no, Trump's going to lose them, just you wait. But I still think that it's possible. That it's possible that these people, under a changing economic set of circumstances within the next few years, could end up not voting Trump, voting independent, or voting Democratic. It kind of depends on what happens. If the economy goes to hell in a handbasket, you never know what's going to happen. There could be a political realignment. And you know what? We kind of saw that under under Biden, where people who we didn't think would vote for Trump actually showed up to vote for Trump because they thought the economy was just bad. And I'm sure that had the economy been stellar as of November 2024 or 2023, around those few years before the 2024 election, fewer people would have flipped from Democratic to Republican votes. It's kind of common sense, to be fair, that the way things are going, even if it's not as a result of the president's policy, the way things are going dictates how people will vote. So I hold out hope that the Republican Party is not necessarily a cult, that there are people who will be willing to criticize Trump, that Trump supporters, even fervent Trump supporters, may still be primed to abandon him in the coming years. But certainly members of the overall Republican Party are not, broadly speaking, within a cult. They could change their minds. They could criticize Trump. We may see that. I mean, whoever thought Mitch McConnell would vote against a Trump nominee? But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you think that I was too soft on the Republican Party and that I should have gone harder against them? Do you think that they are a cult? Do you think that they're not a cult? Let me know what you think. Please like, comment, or subscribe to this channel. I plan to do a video on whether or not the Democratic Party is a cult. Let me know what you think about that in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for watching. See you in the next video.